Before we begin, we want to take a moment to thank our sponsors at Audible. Now that the weather's getting nicer, I'm back to reading and listening to books in the park. And with Audible, it's never been easier. Every month, I get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection. In addition, I get access to news digests from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. If you go to audibletrial.com/YMO podcast, you'll get 2 free audiobooks on us. Download thousands of titles offline anytime, anywhere. Having trouble deciding what to pick? Audible lets you keep your credits for up to a year. Find your summer read and support your favorite National Film Registry podcast. Once again, that's audibletrial.com/YMO podcast. Thank you for your support.
And now, on with the show.
Gentlemen, what's your favorite movie tagline?
This one for me was obviously always going to go in the direction of horror movie taglines because I think one of the most iconic taglines just of all time is, in space, no one can hear you scream. But I think the best one is actually for one that's not the greatest movie in the world. It's pretty solid, but it's just such a great tagline that's such a great build-off as a sequel. And it's the tagline to Jaws 2, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. That's just that's everything you need to know about this movie. It's another Jaws movie, but it's like it's so evocative. It's just it just gets the job done so quick and so cleanly, and it lets you know basically what you're about to get yourself into, and it's more shark action, baby.
I like the fact that Tom and I both have picks that are from not particularly great sequels. Mine involves a bit of a rant because it's also part of my frustration. And Tom's going to know where I'm going with this. But a convention gets introduced in terms of these taglines. And when they stop doing it, I get mad. My pick is not Lethal Weapon. The tagline for Lethal Weapon in 1987 is 2 cops, Glover carries a weapon, Gibson is one. He's the only LA cop registered as a Lethal Weapon. 2 years later, Lethal Weapon 2, 1989. The tagline, the magic is back. Okay, fine. Lethal Weapon 3 in 1992. The tagline is, the magic is back again. And it never fails to make me laugh that they were just like, so the second one, the magic is back. Fine. The third one, the magic is back again. For some reason, the simplicity of that tagline, because there's only one of 2 options. 1, extremely lazy. Or 2, they are aware of how funny it is that is so lazy. And the reason I say there's a rant is that Lethal Weapon 4 in 98, their tagline is, the gang's all here. Absolutely not. You introduce the convention, the magic is back, the magic is back again. The next one needs to continue that. It's like how mad I got, and I remember I was ranting to Tom about this. John Wick Chapter 2, good, there you go. You've told me that the conventions are chapters. Chapter 3, Parabellum, why? It's just 2, 3. You've set up the convention. So, God damn it, Lethal Weapon 4, Gangs All Here, infuriating. My favorite movie tagline is, the magic's back again. Just never fails to make me laugh. Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, we look at one of the first American satires to center on the Soviet Union. Bella Zaydenberg joins us for 1939's Ninotchka.
Our guest today is currently a senior editor at Yahoo. Her work has previously appeared in Us Weekly, Time Out New York, Men's Journal, and Elite Daily, amongst others. Bella Zaydenberg joins us today to talk about Ninotchka. Bella, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Welcome, welcome, welcome.
You could say "Привет" or "Здравствуйте" or any of the above.
That's interesting you say that, Bella, because I would like to point out that normally we would say, like, hi, welcome to You're Missing Out. But, in this case, we could say, bonjour, c'est vous qui manquez un podcast sur le cinéma? Or, privet etovi proposkayet podcast o kino, because this is a film dealing with both the French and Russian people. And our guest today is very mad at one of those pronunciations, because part of the reason you're here, of course, is that you are yourself Russian. You and I have talked about your feelings and your frustrations about the depictions of Russian people in cinema, particularly American cinema, and how you feel like that's, from your point of view, that's not, that's almost never positive. But also, by your own admission, especially before you and I met, you were not the most cinephile person in the world, right?
Right, but also, I do feel a little bit like I'm on trial. But I do feel like this episode was a really long time coming, considering I think, like, even when you and I first started dating,
Which
you
we should have
mentioned
disclosed up top, quite frankly.
Yeah. You mentioned this movie, like, from the jump, and then I didn't see it until, like, what, this winter
Yeah.
with you, and I remember walking out of that theater, and you like, I wasn't saying anything, and we were walking out, and you were just looking at me, like, waiting for me to say something, and I don't think I was giving you anything, and then we walked out, and I was like, "Oh, this movie rules," and yeah, obviously I've seen it since then, and I absolutely love this movie, and I did not expect to. So yeah, this film was really great, but
And
also it's counterintuitive to what I normally see and how I normally see Russians portrayed in American media, which obviously is just not great. I mean, considering what the current political climate is, understandably not great, but this has been going on way before then too. So
now, in fairness, you say, "Oh, when we first started dating, I brought up the movie." That's not entirely true. The truth is that you first heard about it because I referred to you as Ninotchka, because when we
yeah.
first met, we were maybe at odds, because I was very much a talker, a lot of jokes, a lot of pop culture references, and you would just, anytime I'd make a joke and you would stare at me just kind of coldly, I would refer to you that way, because there were so many interactions we would have that were very much like the scene in the film where it's, well, there was a fella named McGillicuddy and a fella named Macintosh. I wish they'd never met. Like, that was kind of what it was. You would just kind of respond, so that would, anytime you responded in any of that kind of, like, anything lovey-dovey is gross and for idiots and anything like that. How many romance films we'd go see where you were just like, I think everyone involved should die. Like, anytime you would pull one of those, I would refer to you that way. And then
So that's
it's
changed with
no,
Bella?
it
No.
has a little. We get there there are times where we watch the break happen more and more. Somebody who, not to sell them out too much, but somebody who, when we first started dating, would see little kids running around a place and go, disgusting. Well, when that little kid in the row in front of us during Doctor Strange 2 went, Thanos, somebody may have found that very amusing this time. Somebody may have thought that was adorable. So, we're getting there. Someone's changing a bit. But I say it because one thing you would bring up a lot is you would talk about your frustrations with how Russians are depicted in film. And I would try and, argue to a degree that wasn't always the case, that there has always been Russian stereotypes in cinema, but they aren't always evil or villainous. And this is a film, obviously, that I would bring up quite a bit. Yes, you're right. We saw it at the Film Forum, right? They were doing
Yeah.
the Garbo. It was supposed to be a 4-film day, and then we forgot what day it was, so we only made it
Yep.
for. I'm trying to think. I think they were showing. I think the first one was Flesh and the Devil, then Anna Christie. I think we missed both of those, but we made it there in time for Anna Karenina, and then they closed out on Ninotchka, which were both 35 millimeter prints, right? Am I crazy? I think we saw it in 35.
You're asking the wrong
That's
person.
true. Okay, we saw. And it was, you're right, it was great because we left Anna Karenina. You really enjoyed that, but then we went back into Ninotchka. I was very nervous because it is such a comedy, and as you noted, you enjoyed it. We got you have the biography as well, right?
Yes, I do, by Robert Gottlieb.
So you saw it over the winter. You saw it again. Tom, was this your first time seeing Ninotchka?
Yeah, first time, and because it was my first time, and it was honestly a movie I didn't know anything about. like no context clues what this movie was going to be. I kind of just leaned into it and watched it as like blind, and pleasantly surprised the whole time. It was a very charming movie. A very charming movie. Helped thaw my black heart for 2 hours, and made me say, well, I don't want to see anybody in a happy relationship right now, but all right, I guess these two can be okay.
It's funny because, like, the first time I watched it, I absolutely fell in love and I wanted them to be together and I was so into that. And then the second time I watched it, while at the end I also wanted them to be together, it took about 75% of the movie to happen for me to want that. Because the first 75% of the movie, I hated Melvyn Douglas. But then I ended up loving him, so it all worked out.
I mean, I saw this, I think, for the first time when I was very young. I think it was like one of those Turner Classic Movies films that was on, and I think somebody in my house was like, "Oh, that's a classic." But it's not a movie that a kid can get. And not because it's not funny, but number one, there's not a lot of slapstick humor. And number two,
Biggest thing I can hold against it. No slapstick. Slapstick's the best.
I would argue that there is quite a bit of, like, slapstick and physical humor in it, though.
I
mean,
I
yeah, considering what, like, is super popular in Russia, that is exactly what this movie is.
but I'm saying we'll get into that more in a sec. But what I mean is just more like when you're a kid, for like a child, like part of the stuff that like there are certain comedies that when you're a kid you can still click with because even though the jokes and the premise don't land, like we recently did Bringing Up Baby, and Bringing Up Baby lands for you no matter what age you are because a lot of the humor, even like physical humor, requires some level of stakes. But at the end of the day, when there's a big tiger and somebody pulling on its tail, you understand that at any age. I think that this is, Ninotchka for me when I saw it the first time didn't totally land because most of the comedic premises rely on you understanding the cultural differences between the two of them. And remember, we're born in 1990, like the Soviet Union is not a thing. And we don't really like there's no understanding on like a kid's end of like
We do get half. I think kids of the 90s would get half of the cultural stuff going on because if, kids growing up in the 90s, we had Looney Tunes. So we already knew
Yeah.
that the French were just
Mhm.
shitless, horny animals. And so we didn't get the stereotypes that Russians are fuddy-duddies who only like when
Yeah, that's the thing. Like
people
the
fall.
stereo that Bella has talked about the stereotype of Russians in film, and I think one thing I would try and point out is if you're looking at kind of the Russian stereotypes that we inherited from like the Reagan 80s onward, it's always they're spies, they're villains, they're this and that. But it is interesting that in like the 30s and 40s, the Russian stereotypes that we rely on comedically in film are they're very uptight, they're very cold and high-minded and intellectual, and they're always talking about the common man and all that, which is it's a more playful kind of stereotype that we have in films for Italians and French and those kind of things. But so that's the first time I saw it, and I didn't really land with me as a young person. And then I watched it years later, I think just out of college, and suddenly was won over on this thing because at that point I knew who Ernst Lubitsch was, and then I saw Billy Wilder's name on the script, and I knew I adored Billy Wilder. For Some Like It Hot and so many of the other comedies that I'd seen. Yeah, so then I've watched it several times since, and I continue to be won over by how well it works. But before we get into all of the things that made this film great, all the things that make this film matter, let's talk about what the registry had to say. So here's what the Library of Congress had to say about Ninotchka. In this sparkling romantic comedy, when a beautiful Soviet emissary, Greta Garbo, is sent to Paris on state business, she discovers how the charms of Paris and Melvyn Douglas can melt even the most stoic Soviet, and jeopardizes both national honor and her career. Garbo personifies director Ernst Lubitsch's sophistication and style, delivering dialogue cooked up by Billy Wilder and partner Charles Brackett to reveal that the Swedish actress is not only a consummate dramatist, but that, in fact, Garbo Laughs, as the ads touted. A trio of Russian delegates played by Sig Ruman, Felix Bressert, and Alexander Granich deliver some of Wilder and Brackett's most satirical lines. So that's what the National Film Registry had to say. I also want to point out the National Film Registry apparently does not like Walter Reich, the third writer on the film, who they just left out of that synopsis.
Much like the third
Yeah,
Russian at the
Kapolsky,
end
yes.
with the restaurant.
I always forget. Like, I hate to jump ahead to the ending, but I truly, even when Bella and I rewatched to take notes of this, I always forget that's how the movie ends.
It's a weird ending.
I always forget that stinger is on there.
It's a weird little bit. I
Right?
don't hate it, but it's weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always thought it ended. I mean, always thought. I for some reason thought that it ended with a kiss, and then when it didn't, that
Yeah.
was.
I always, for the last 6 months, have thought it ended.
On that note, when we talk about Greenwich, Tom, do you know? I have it here. Did you recognize the guy that played not Greenwich? Did you recognize the guy that played Kapolsky?
No.
Alexander Granich, who played Kapolsky. You probably know him as Knock from Nosferatu.
Really?
Yep. Every one of these guys had like such an interesting, because when the movie started, I was looking up on our last rewatch. I was looking up where these guys are, and
It's been a minute since I've seen Nosferatu, though. To be
Yeah.
fair,
and they look totally different. Like,
Yeah,
he looks totally different now.
it's like 25 years later.
Yeah, Felix Bressert would work with Lubitsch a couple times. For folks listening who have seen Shop Around the Corner, he's in that. Felix Bressert, who plays Bulyanov. He's also Greenberg in To Be or Not to Be, where he gets the great "Hath Not a Jew" monologue. And Sig Rumen, who plays Ivanov, was also in To Be or Not to Be. He plays the character known as Concentration Camp Earhart. So for anybody
Oof.
who knows, it's we haven't watched To Be or Not to Be, but when you see it, it's a weird thing that Lubitsch manages to make play for laughs. Which is a fascinating thing, is that, like, Bella and I were talking about this the other day, where there is this fascinating thing in the 30s and 40s where these directors who came from Eastern European countries, who came from Germany, who came from Poland, who came from Russia, to the U.S., tackled the war and tackled the geopolitical conflicts in such an interesting way in film. I mean, obviously, something we talked about, and European immigrants. Another film that comes out this same year as Ninotchka is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is Frank Capra. And when we did our episode, we talked a lot about Frank Capra's perception of America, and obviously neither Ninotchka or To Be or Not to Be or The Shop Around the Corner or any of the notable Lubitsch films are set in the U.S., but there is just this interesting perspective on geopolitical relationships from them that I think American directors don't totally capture, because there's just something about this film. I think that, Bella, you talked about, again, Russians in film and how they're depicted, and I do think it's interesting that in this film, one of the things I take away from it a lot is that while there are jokes at the expense of Russia and the Russian characters, there are also a lot of jokes at the expense of the French and at the expense of Melvyn Douglas and those characters. So I think it's a bit more of an, I don't know if you agree, but I find it to be a more even-handed satire than other comedies, quote unquote, lampooning the Soviets.
Right. And so many comedies and action films and any films that do have Russian characters, whether they're the villains or not, they are the butt of every joke. They are, like you said earlier, they are cold and detached and just not fully formed characters and not fully formed people. And it's just a walking stereotype. Whereas this film portrayed them in, yeah, there were jokes made at their expense, as there were the French, but it felt like it was handled with kid gloves. It felt like it was way more. It had an infinitely more nuanced portrayal of Ninotchka and her comrades.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, and Tom, obviously, Tom, you've watched so many movies, B movies and such from the 1980s and 1990s. Would you say it is fair to say that this film contains a more nuanced portrait of the Russian people than some of the Cold War era films that come later?
Yeah, I mean, just by default that it is pre-Cold War, and while we're not allied with them yet, because they haven't shifted over to the Allied side in the European conflict that's kind of starting at this point. I mean, Russia shifts, what, 41, 42 to the
Oh
Allied
no,
side?
No, Russia's there much earlier. By 42, Italy
When
has
did they
shifted over
shift?
to the Allies.
Yeah, so
Russia is actually more involved in Russia is involved in the war before we get involved.
Yeah.
Later in the third in the like 38, they are trying to, or somewhere around there, they are trying to compromise with Hitler's Germany, but then they very quickly kind of realize, oh, he's trying to get in here, and
yeah, because
team up.
when did they start invading in Russia? Because that was the winter of what, like 40,
Yeah,
39?
I think that's 40. I don't
So
have
so
all the
at
dates,
this
but yes.
point, so at the point of this movie's made, they either are still on the Nazi side or are about to be, or just left the Nazi side of the
So
war. But
they're
we're still
yeah.
like, it's still a thing of, we're not friends with them necessarily yet, or most of Europe is not necessarily friends with them at this point. But the Cold War brings out a whole new thing, because when it comes to cinema and genre movies, which is where most of this Russian shit comes to, you need bad guys, and the geopolitics of the time kind of dictates what the bad guys are going to be. And so for a long time, it was the Russians. I mean, Spielberg threw it back to the 40s with the 30s with the Indiana Jones movies, but by the time he gets to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he's like, all right, we're in the 50s. I mean, it's got to be the Russians. And, I mean, that was even a big thing when GoldenEye was coming out, or they were making GoldenEye, because in between License to Kill and GoldenEye, the Soviet Union fell. So everyone's like, all right, well, what the fuck are spy movies going to do for bad guys? There are no, like, bad guys anymore. To the point where, like, True Lies did Middle Eastern terrorists just because, like, I don't know, we need something. And that's aged kind of poorly.
They're predictable, right? Having a Russian villain is always
Well, because it was like 50 years basically, or like, yeah, like what, 40 years of using the same bad guys. It's gonna get stale at some point, and a lot of filmmakers that are doing this shit by the time the 80s are rolling around are not the most artistically minded guys. They're guys doing shit for Menachem Golan at Canon Films, which is just like, yeah, I don't know, we got leftover Soviet outfits, I don't know, fucking throw them on. Robert Forster's a Russian now. Yeah, Robert Forster, he's going to be doing a Russian accent. Whatever, it's fine. And it's not, like, acceptable or whatever, but it is just a thing of, the routine, it kind of got old pretty quickly, and, kind of, you look at this and you go, why doesn't anybody learn the lessons from the ones that do this shit right?
well, I think by default Hollywood will stick to a sense of nostalgia or convention because it will make money. And we
Yeah.
are used to seeing don't quote me on that. I think I pulled that from the Vanity Fair article, but
Ninotchka
it's
Afterlife.
but it's true. I mean, there is always going to be a degree of nostalgia to it because the American people are so used to seeing Russians as the villains,
Yeah.
and they are so used to seeing a Russian bad guy. And the funny part of that is that it is so rarely ever played by a actor or actress that is actually from Russia or East in general. And it is so frustrating, especially like the amount of times Mike and I have been to a movie where there is a Russian character at all playing any role whatsoever. Their accents are always shit. And the only modern day actor that I can safely say actually does a good job is Florence Pugh, and everyone else is absolutely shitty at it.
Well, it's just a thing with Hollywood, because I mean, how many times have we thus far in the show, and we'll have to continue doing so, about westerns and the portrayal of Native Americans, where you go, huh, they just got a really tan Italian guy, and they didn't tell him to do anything with his voice other than talk like this, or
Yeah.
like whatever. And it's just like, oh, so this is just the problem. I mean, with Hollywood and American movies in general, which I don't know, I guess it's starting to change, since it's easier to, I don't know, get Russian actors or Russian writers and hire people from the right places to do these things. But for a long time, they just didn't give a shit about realism, and they just said, yeah, whatever, the schmoes will pay their nickel to get it, and they don't care. They'll get the gist of it. We
I
got their
think
money.
it's first off, to clarify a bit of timeline here. In 1938, that's when Italy and France and the United Kingdom signed the Munich Agreement with Germany. In later 1939, Germany invades Poland in September 39. Stalin waits to launch his own invasion. It's not till 41 that Hitler invades the Soviet Union, but they were already allied. They were already teamed with the Allies at this point. I think what happens, and our relationship with the Soviet Union at this time during the war, at least in the United States, is more akin to the fact that prior to the full partnership of the Axis between Germany and Italy and Japan, it's important to remember that at this time in Europe, Germany is making aggressive territory moves. Italy is making their aggressive war in North Africa. The Soviets are making expansion moves, and the Japanese are making expansion moves. And until there's a clear picture of good guy, bad guy, there's a lot of touch and go feelings throughout the global community of like, is this just a case of a bunch of strong countries going after other places? When it comes to why the Soviets are villains so often and things, I think there's an interesting element to this too, which is look at what is done here in Ninotchka in the sense that they are relying on a particular stereotype for each nationality, right? That the stereotype of the French is the absolute lovers, the total. I mean, there's a reason they picked France as the epitome of capitalistic decadence, and then the Soviet Union as, the original. There are very strong political and cultural beliefs there. I think part of what made the Soviet Union such great villains in movies for a while, or such go-to villains, is that at the end of the day, the Soviet Union is defined by ideology, right? In a way that like the Nazis made great villains for Spielberg, because when you put up that flag, you tell the audience, we know what these guys are about. And the struggle that the Bond films have had, and the struggle that any films that tried to tackle the war on terror had, is you need to have a 10-minute scene where a character like lays out like, this is why the villain wants to do what he does. He has diamonds in his face, and he and he wants to turn the world's water into candy, or whatever the hell the motives are. But that, when you look at that, when there is that ideology built in, and we understand like, this is okay, we got it. I understand what these characters are motivated by. I think that what's so interesting about this particular film is that at the end of the day, it's easy to write this film or to take this film as a communist girl embraces capitalism, which ultimately is how it was first pitched as a logline. But I do think there's more to it than that, because I really think it is using politics and personal politics and ethics to create that classic rom-com dynamic of he's got to change a little bit to come down to her level, and she's got to change a little bit to come to his level, so that the two of them come together. So I think
Well,
that's something that this does in an interesting way.
I mean, because they don't even explain anything in the
No.
they don't, like they say, you like in movies now they have to explain the politics and the plan and everything. It's just like, yeah, she's coming over from the Soviet Union. She's gonna look into this diamond thing. We get it. We get her. We get her thing. We get this guy's thing. He's a horny Frenchman. Whatever. I mean,
Well, I think,
like it's that. It's just it's all about simplicity, and
Yeah.
it makes things a
well,
lot easier, and it allows them to have a more well-rounded characterization for her, and then also having these three dopes running around that are not the typical Soviet Union, bad guys you see in a Cannon Films movie or whatever. It's like, oh no, these guys are kind of like, yeah, they're kind of doofuses, and they're working for the state, and it feels like this is kind of the only jobs they could get, and they're getting really, really, really tantalized by all the shit capitalism has, and they're just. I mean, the bit where when she first comes in and they like, oh, do you want a cigarette? Oh, please send up cigarettes. And 3 smoking hot cigarette girls come up. She goes, I take it you are doing more than smoking. And it's like, oh,
I think she says something like, you must have been smoking a lot.
yeah,
Something
or
like
something like that. I think
Right.
I think yeah, it's just like, okay, these guys. No, let's get this straight. Number one, those guys rule. They're the best. Love them. Disney Plus spinoff series when.
They don't own this one. This is an MGM picture.
All right, give it a few years, okay, please. Okay, Amazon series
Hey,
with the Ted
hey.
Lasso guys.
Sorry, Bella, you want to say?
Yes, continue.
oh no, just a couple of thoughts here. One, France wasn't just picked because it's the antithesis of Russian ideology. A lot of former Russian royals that were disgraced as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution moved to France.
Yeah.
So that was a natural choice.
Mhm.
And the other part of it too is that the oh my god, I'm forgetting the name of the three men now, but
Bulyanov, Ivanov, and Kapolsky.
yes, them. I love how I am the one that can't pronounce their names, even though I should. They aren't atypical to, again, what you see in like made in Russian film.
Mhm.
They are the standard. They are normal. They are, yes, partially for comedic relief, but they are just, they're normal guys. They wouldn't necessarily be seen as something out of the ordinary or extraordinarily stupid or extraordinarily funny. They would just kind of be there. And I think it's interesting that this film relies on them as comedic relief when they just wouldn't really be seen as that in Russian film at all.
Well, I think that part of that is they are, and I'm throwing this out, for those of us that are old enough to remember this, but they are the 1930s equivalent of the Festrunk brothers, right? For anybody listening, Tom, you know what I'm talking about, right? The Steve Martin, Dan Aykroyd SNL sketch
Oh yeah, okay.
that
I
were
forgot.
about
I
the
didn't remember the
two.
names.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was a sketch in like the 80s, and the gag was they were two former Eastern Europeans who come to America and become so entranced by America that they refer to themselves as, for anyone who doesn't know the Festrunk Brothers, it's that we are two wild and crazy guys. We are going to find beautiful American women with their big American breasts. Like, that was them. And I think that that's the beauty of Ivanov and Bulyanov and that character, is that the joke of them, the core joke of them, is just that they are somebody from a place of very little, or they had a lot of responsibility, or that they had to be moral in a certain way, and now they come to a new place where the morals are completely changed. And I feel like that's not even a Russian joke, or a joke on the Russians, insofar as, I mean, if you look at right now, you can go on Netflix and watch 2 seasons of Emily in Paris, where the
Uh, uh,
core
uh,
these
excuse me, Amelie and Perry, please.
Amelie and Perry, you're right. Where this
I can't believe you watched
where
this.
the sole joke of it is Emily is the Ninotchka, if you will. She's super uptight. She's uncomfortable with any sexual talk. She doesn't like to be flirted with, and she has to deal with the very, very sexual French, which is a funny thing to think that, 70 plus years after Ninotchka, 90 plus years after Ninotchka, we're doing it again, except now the Americans are the uptight, moralistic ones in France.
Right in the middle there, 80 years. 80 years. In
80
between
years.
70, 90. Yeah,
Right,
I mean,
yeah, 'cause we're, yeah.
and
Right.
it's honest, it's just simply the simple basis of a lot of comedies is it's just fish out of water. Look at these three dopes. And then look, oh no, their boss is here. And you just watch these three guys, and they're never like treated like subhuman or like cartoon they still feel distinctly human, and they all three of the guys feel different from each other. It's just it's the clash of cultures. It's these guys getting seduced, and it's like not even hard to seduce them is the joke. Like
Yeah.
Ninotchka, it takes a while for her to like realize, okay, I still believe in the Soviet cause, but like there's some good shit in capitalist France, where these guys are the movie starts with them talking themselves into getting a bigger room, spent like going to the more expensive hotel, the bigger room. They like, oh well, we could split it into three smaller boxes and put them into smaller safes. Oh, but why would we do that? We could just get the bigger room. Wouldn't Lenin want us to have the bigger room? It's
That's
just
it's so that bit too, because again, it's that wilder dialogue where it's Bulyanov going, well, we could split it into three smaller boxes and put it in smaller safes. That's an idea. And then Sig just going, but who says we have to have an idea? Just
yeah,
great. And
yeah.
it's funny, Tom, you mentioned fish out of water comedies, because I was thinking about that and the fact that at the end of the day, that is something that we all share in a sense. I mean, I have seen even Russian comedies like to do fish out of water stuff. For example, could you imagine the hilarity of The Adventures of Italians in Russia, a very real film that I'm holding in my hands right now, that if you want it, it's a Russian Italian co-production, and in truth, in the case of both those countries and how their film industries worked, this film was co-directed by Russia's greatest comedic director, who had made their most beloved comedies like Office Romance and Enjoy Your Bath, and the Italian director made a bunch of B-movie knockoffs of Conan and The Godfather. So
Hell
really
yeah.
just summing up the cultures beautifully.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Italians, they know what they're doing, baby. They know what people want in their movies.
But it's also like, Bella, you and I watched, I don't know what the Russian title would be, but here it's either Diamond Arm or The Man with the Diamond Arm, right?
Mhm.
What's the title? The actual title?
Бриллиантовая рука.
Thank you. And again, even that, I mean, it's a very different kind of movie, but even that is just like a very kind of antics-based, like culture-based comedy. So that is something that kind of crosses over, and I do wonder, if I don't know, I couldn't find much information on how this film played in Russia itself, if it ever played there. I know that by 1940, anything that the studio system in America made that was less than flattering about the Soviet Union just did not get distributed there at all, because it was suddenly like, they're our friends now and we can't play them as uptight, and every depiction of Russians during the war had to be like, they are the bravest, most heroic and wonderful people I have ever known. Like anything about Russians in film during the war sounds like that quote that they all repeat in The Manchurian Candidate about he's the best. What was it? You know what I'm talking about, right, Tom?
I know, but I don't remember off the top of my
Colonel
head.
whatever is the greatest. Yeah,
Colonel
but
Shaw
very,
is the bravest, the most courageous. Yeah,
Yes,
Colonel Shaw.
yeah. It's that same kind of thing.
From what I see, my brief research, it was banned in the Soviet Union and
Okay.
its satellite countries. So I think there was just not really into a movie where Greta Garbo learns how that maybe there's some good stuff in capitalism and horny Frenchmen are okay.
So you're saying that the Soviet government did not take kindly to the line, the last group of mass trials went well, there will be fewer but better Russians? You think they had an issue with that line somehow?
Great line. That is some Iannucci shit.
This script is, I will tell you this, because now Bella's seen it a couple times and I've seen it many times. Tom, every time you watch this, you're going to find new lines. It is one of those classic Billy Wilder scripts.
It's an amazingly written script. I mean, I texted you when I was watching it, when she goes to the restaurant and she orders like beets and leaves and figs, and the waiter goes, "Madame, this is a restaurant, not a meadow."
It's so
I'm just like,
good. No, she ordered raw beets and carrots.
Raw beets and carrots. Right.
Raw beets and carrots.
We would not get figs. That is way too indulgent.
Excuse me for messing up the food order that I would never make myself. So,
I wouldn't make it either. Beets are gross.
Now, I do want to talk a bit about because obviously, Bella, you're here for a number of reasons, but one of them is, of course, that after watching those two films that we went to see, you read Garbo's biography and you became very kind of fascinated by her and her story. So I did want to talk about, one thing you've mentioned to me, off mic is her relationship with this film. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, she, I mean, by and large, did not care for most of the movies that she made, except for one, and it wasn't this one. The only movie that she really cared for was Queen Christina, because she got to play someone that was a cross-dresser and someone that, had a female love interest and that she got to kiss, and she got to say that she was going to die a bachelor. And it's really interesting to see Garbo play someone that, in the beginning of her career, she played these really vampy, over-sexualized at the time roles. And this was, in Ninotchka, that was the one time that she didn't get to do that. And theoretically, it would be something that she would like, because she wasn't someone that considered herself overly sexual. She dressed in men's button-downs and pants and, like, wasn't, a quote-unquote, like, quintessentially feminine woman. But, yeah, she did not necessarily care for this film. She kind of saw it as okay, like, I'm done, and just moved on. And yet it was, I believe, her most, if not one of her most successful films.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, one of the things we should talk about a bit is the tagline for this movie, as mentioned in the opening paragraph, is Garbo Laughs. That's in part because, and now I got to look it up because I'm feeling like an idiot that instead I have a document open here on Russian spy films, so that's not going to help us much now. We're off that topic.
Anna Christie.
Anna Christie is the first one, right? So Anna Christie is the first sound picture that she does, and they advertised it as Garbo Talks. And
A little, Mike,
because
a little more energy. There's an exclamation point in this tagline.
Garbo Talks,
All right, relax.
so, eat snacky smalls.
It's next most.
So they have Garbo Talks. So when they got to this film, because it is a comedy, and Garbo didn't really do comedies, they advertised it as Garbo Laughs. That was the tagline. All they needed to sell it on. And, if you look at film compilations, obviously this film, Ninotchka, has fallen kind of out of the public consciousness in the last couple decades, I think because of the political situation. But if you look at compilations about like greatest films or even just like the magic of the movies, one of the iconic scenes that they will show alongside King Kong climbing the building and, Rhett saying, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. One of the iconic things they'll show is her laughing and hitting that table. It was just one of those landmark, memorable movie moments. It should be noted, some people like to point out that Garbo had laughed in other movies before, but most of those laughs are like in Anna Karenina when she's laughing playfully at the child that she's never going to see again, trying to hold back tears. So that doesn't really count, I think, as a genuine, joyful laugh.
She actually had a film prior to Ninotchka where she was portrayed as someone really happy, but it is the One Lost Garbo film.
Yeah, of course it is.
So
Yeah.
who knows? She played a happy wife and she was running around in a little house dress and was very theoretically very happy. But there are conspiracy theories. It was actually found in a Moscow archive, so somehow it makes sense. But there is one conspiracy theory about her laugh in Ninotchka, and that is that she didn't actually laugh, that it was dubbed over.
Interesting. Like, as in, she's pretending that she's pantomiming, but they added somebody else's voice?
This is what I read in the biography, and there's a theory out there that her laugh was dubbed over when Leon falls off the chair. So a lot of people think that because the laugh doesn't quite match up with the sound, but I didn't notice anything, so maybe someone more eagle-eyed did.
That feels like one of those things where, I don't know, man, if you watch a lot of old movies in HD now, the sound doesn't line up. That was one of those things where, like, in 1939, they were probably just, like, taking cigarette hits while they were editing the movie going, no one's gonna notice, right? This thing's gonna play in a theater for 3 weeks. They're barely gonna see it. And then when you watch in HD, there's so many things. We did another movie recently where I talked about how many lines seem to be ADR'd in later. But I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe that is a conspiracy. Maybe, you know what? Let's call up Sean and Carrie McCabe. They've got the Conspiracy Theory podcast. Let's get them on this one. Let's do a full episode on Garbo's fake Ninotchka laugh.
We got to roll this into a queue. Somehow, Garbo's fake laugh
That's what pulls it all together.
You'll hear Garbo's fake laugh emanating from the skies, and JFK Jr. will finally appear.
But no, I think that's so interesting. They bring that up, Bill, because I mean, there is something about Garbo. I was thinking about one of the notes I took that's so fascinating is that, and this is a slight spoiler for what we'll talk about at the end, but that this is Garbo's final Oscar nomination for this movie. And then after this, she makes like one more movie and then is done. By 1941, she is done acting. Meanwhile, Melvyn Douglas goes on to win 2 Oscars, one in 1960-something and one in 1970-something, one for HUD and one for being there. And I just think it's so interesting that you look at this movie, and it is it's the exact cross-section where her career this is either, if you want to call it the peak, or at least like this is the precipice before the end. And Melvyn Douglas, if you look at everything he had done prior to this, mostly movies nobody talks about anymore. This is the first Melvyn Douglas film that anybody really talks about, at least in terms of talks about him in, but then goes on to become one of our most revered actors. He wins 2 Oscars. He wins the acting Triple Crown because he has an Emmy, a Tony, and the 2 Oscars, and has this just incredible run. And it's such an interesting intersection for them, especially the fact that both of them spent their final years living in New York. Both of them died in New York. Douglas dies in 81, I want to say, and then Garbo dies in 90. Am I right about that? Something like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, she died in, like, I think it was somewhere, like, on the Upper East Side, like, that building is still there. Her, apartment was actually up for sale a couple years ago, and by very tempted, I mean, there's no way I could afford that, but still,
We could
Yeah,
sell the cat. It's fine.
he died
we'll
in
sell the cat.
81. She died in 90.
Yeah, and I mean, that is one of those things that is wild to think about in terms of like, when you hear about Veronica Lake, who I think had a similar relationship to her work in terms of like at a certain point she just kind of stopped acting and was just like, yeah, I'm fine, I'm good, and she never loved a lot of the movies she did. But Veronica Lake, she had some health issues and she was tending bar and she would take little indie things here and there, and you kind of at least knew a little bit about her. It's wild to, or that she was kind of, she just trailed off. It's wild to think about the fact that Greta Garbo just existed in New York City for virtual almost 50 years after making a film. That is wild to think about, especially because she was so famous in her day. Like, I think people listening now might not realize, you may know the name because she's referenced in everything from like Everything Old is New Again to Vogue by Madonna. But you look, Belle and I have recently been watching a lot of old Disney cartoons from the 30s. And
Shocking.
and the amount of times that like not only does Garbo get referenced, but she's caricatured so often in the same way that like that you could just see a caricature of her and know who she is, the same way that like a lot of us inherited knowing who Mae West or the Marx Brothers or W.C. Fields are because of cartoons. Like, Tom, you've never seen a Mae West movie, right? Or a W.C. Fields movie.
I don't believe so.
But maybe you don't know them by name, but like if you see somebody doing the "Well, my little chickadee," you know what that is because you've seen it in 90 Looney Tunes cartoons,
Yes, I do.
And Garbo was at that level where you could just show a little picture of her, a cartoon, and people knew who it was. It's crazy to think that by 39, I mean, by 41, she's just out of the picture,
And it wasn't even, like, a hard and fast stop either. Like, there was never an intentional, "I will no longer make any films." It was more so, "Hey, I'm gonna wait for the next project that I really want to be in," and then that project just never came. There were a few projects she was interested in, but she just never wanted to pursue them any further. And she also just hated being famous. Just one of those people that just did not want to be seen. And like she, I believe, says in the film, she just wants to be alone. And it's really fascinating to see someone that, like, again, did just reach these extreme, like, this extreme A-list status at the time, and then just wanted nothing to do with it. And part of the reason that she did live in this, like, really secluded building in New York is because she just, and it's, like, right by the East River, like, it's a, cul-de-sac, like, you're not getting in there. Um, I just find that really fascinating about her, that she just was, strangely similar to, the character that she played, where she just wanted nothing to do, like, she didn't necessarily want the fame, she didn't want the recognition, she just wanted to do her craft and be good at it, and then be left alone outside of that.
And it's interesting too in terms of, you mentioned the "want to be alone." I mean, that line originates in, I think, Grand Hotel, which is right. Am I wrong?
Maybe. She has said
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
she
she has said
definitely
that.
says it in Grand Hotel. Now,
Yeah.
Grand Hotel is the only movie she was ever in that wins Best Picture. I think it's like the fourth or fifth Best Picture winner.
It's Grand Hotel.
Um, Grand Hotel, yeah. And so and that had become so famous and so associated with her and lampooned in so many cartoons and other things that Ninotchka does a riff on it, because you have that moment where she's talking to the butler, who she calls Little Father, and has that, go to sleep, Little Father, and then dips into what I think is so fun about this is that she does the line, "We want to be alone," in her doing an impression of people's Greta Garbo impressions, right? That she drops her voice a little octave.
I see it as more, and I mean, you kind of see this a lot in her personal life too, where she was, as I mentioned earlier, somewhat, she was really entranced by I guess the lack of gender binary. She loved to, again, wear men's clothes. She wanted to, or I guess I can't say that she wanted because I am not her, but um she found herself to be more masculine, I guess, than the traditional woman was at the time, or the conventional feminine ideal was at the time. Um, there's this really great line from that Gottlieb biography where he says, quote, "How ironic is it that the most beautiful woman in the world would really rather have been a man?" And I just I think that part of the reason she says that at that point in that film is because that is exactly something that a man would say when he is alone with a beautiful woman, that we just want to be alone.
Well, that's the other thing that I think is great about the comedy in this film is that I think that it's very easy if you try and make this later, or many people have tried to do the rom-com and can't crack it in terms of you and I were discussing this when we were watching it, which is number one, I think the problem with too many romantic comedies today is they're very one-sided in terms of, they tend to know which audience they're playing to, and they make the love interest, whether it's the often described manic pixie dream girl or just the perfect man, where it's like, the character we're supposed to find ourselves in is always like a chaotic mess who's got a million problems and is just like us, and then their love interest is perfect and ideal, and you kind of go, well, I see what they see in the love interest, I don't know what they see in them. What I think this does so well, and Tom, you made a joke up top about saying like, I don't want to see any people happy, but I'm happy to see them together. I think part of what this film does well and plays to that is that it's not necessarily interested, and the best rom-coms do this, it's not interested in you wanting to be with Garbo or wanting to be with Melvyn Douglas. It's setting up a dynamic where those two should be together, and you want to see those two characters because they are so diametrically opposed, because they are what the other one needs, because Melvyn Douglas is such a kind of louse and such a guy who is coasting on charm that you want somebody who's going to smack him down and that his lines don't work on. And at the same time, Ninotchka is such an uptight stick in the mud that you want to see somebody get her to get over herself for a little bit. And I think that that's the dynamic that really pops in this film.
And I do think it's best served in that neither of these characters really ever give up on who they are.
Mm-hmm.
They never, like I said, like she's still a communist at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
He's still a rapacious capitalist who's, like he said, he's willing to bankrupt Russia by just opening up all these restaurants all over the world. So they just
good.
keep bleeding people that are going to defect and everything. He's still a capitalist. She's still, but he's reading communist literature. She's starting to enjoy, the restaurant in the Eiffel Tower and all this shit, whatever, listening to music instead of the fucking news.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they don't ever sacrifice the characters for the happy ending. They are who they are, but they do come to a middle ground where they're the same people at the beginning of the movie. They've let their shields down, like you get that bit where you get the sense that he's kind of heartbroken over the Duchess. He's still got the picture of her on his desk, and then he puts it away. That's why he's such a walking hard on. She's so, she almost fucking died in the communist uprising in 1920. So it's like you get where they're coming from, and they're still who they are, but the shields are just down a little bit. And I
Well, and
think
I
that's
think
what a lot of these movies don't do. It's always, like you said, it's one-sided. It's always the woman who has to stop being such a goddamn bitch who wants to just work and be a strong woman. She's got to bend the knee to a guy, and it's like,
or it's the Seth Rogen type who's got to get his shit together and grow up and be a man. I think the other thing you point out, Tom, when you say about him, he's going to open all these restaurants and bankrupt them. I think what's great about that line is that by that point in the film, by that point, he has figured her out in terms of like the game of Ninotchka and how to win her over, if you will, is that she is very proud of having principles, right?
Yeah.
And even if she knows that some of her principles are silly, she's never going to let herself admit that, right? When the three other guys, when Bulyanov and Ivanov and all of them are talking about how much better things were in Paris, she's the one that's constantly going, no, things are good here too. Things are very good here. She's so attached to the party, she's so attached to her work that she can't fully ever denounce that. So what Douglas figures out is he has to be able to give her an out in the
Yeah.
way that the film begins with Ivanov, Bulyanov, and all them kind of doing the, you know, well, let's make it so that we have no choice, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's make it that we're not bad, that we're not bad Russians. It's actually, for the good of the country we're doing this. And it ultimately ends with him saying, to her, like, well, if you go, I'll have to keep corrupting, Soviet envoys. And she just goes, well, if it's choosing between my happiness and the good of my country, what can I do? And like, obviously, she knows that it's a put on, but she's playing into it because it gives her. I think the big thing is the balance they have to strike is Douglas learns like he has to allow her to be able to stop being a stick in the mud while retaining her dignity. And I think that that's what's so important about that ending and the whole way that this film plays out is that one of the great bits is that what puts him on his heels is that he meets her just as a gorgeous woman on the street and he decides he's going to seduce her. And when she just kind of goes like, yeah, I'll go back to your hotel. I mean, your apartment. I'll go back to your apartment immediately. That, as opposed to this being a more gross comedy like we have today where it's all about the guys trying to get the girl to sleep with him, she's very upfront about like, yeah, we'll go back to your apartment and I'll sleep with you. But he's like, that throws him off. The fact that he can't use his charm on her and it becomes about like, no, I want to romance this woman. This is a wall that I need to break down. And I think
Yeah.
that that's so, I mean, the great moment where, as you talk about, Tom, typically it'd be the woman who has this, that without gendering it, per se, without doing like any kind of gag that's like, oh, he's the lady in this relationship, you do have that great moment where he comes in as the Lothario and he's trying to do his Frenchman charms. He lays a kiss on her and there's the confidence in his face of like, that's it, I made the move. She kisses him back and his head stays tilted back. And for that moment, he's now the woman in the rom-com. He's now the dynamic that they typically give the woman in the rom-com of how can I make this person, wow, yowza, he's the what is it they talk about in is it Princess I hate that I'm pulling this bullet. You remember in Princess Diaries 2, she talks about having the kiss
No.
with her leg kicking up in the back.
Yeah.
Right. Like that I always remember that because I'm like, it's the first time I ever went like, oh yeah, that is kind of movie shorthand. But like, that's what he wants. She gives
Well,
him the kiss that he has the leg kind of metaphorically kicked back on.
Well, she is a domineering woman in every aspect of her life, except without being domineering. She's just kind of forced to live within these really rigid confines of her behavior um in terms of her job and in terms of how she fits in within Russia and um within her role as a communist and comrade, whatever she is. Um but this is the first time that we really see her take charge in a way that is entirely outside of her scope of work and also um I think is a reflection of no, that is she has that in her and is she doesn't know how to be around men in a way in or a romantic partner of any sense in a way that is submissive at all or is soft at all. She is going to be very hard and semi literally, I guess, um in all aspects of her life.
And I think that's interesting because, what I was thinking about, to give our listeners more homework of finding movies in poor rips on YouTube, I was thinking about you and I watched a Russian romantic comedy, which I know to some listeners might sound like a contradiction, but those do exist, and they're fun.
They're so good.
But we watched one that is one of the most popular ones over there called Office Romance, and what I think is so interesting
That
about
one's so great.
that though is that is an entire movie that plays out. It is a similar. In a way, it's similar in that the woman in that film, who is the boss at the company, it's about a subordinate trying to win over his boss, basically. That she is also uptight and needs to let her hair down a bit. But that at the start of that film, the dynamic is the male love interest who wants to win over is just goaded by his friends of like, hey, if you seduce the boss, you'll get a better job. And like your job will be better. And it's like it is such a functional, mechanical kind of thing for the first half of the movie until the two of them discover that they actually like each other. And what I think is so interesting is that Ninotchka is a movie that basically takes the woman out of an office romance type film, a Russian, film where viewing love and sex in that kind of functional way, and then pairs her with what is essentially a watered down Maurice Chevalier, with a French Lothario, where everything is about pretty words and everything is about the seduction and everything is about playing the game. And I think that what's great is for the first half of the movie, he is flirting with her and he's playing the game, and she rejects the game entirely, and that's what frustrates him. You have that moment where she says, "Must you flirt?" And he goes, "Well, I don't have to, but I find it natural." And she just goes, "Suppress it." Which is, one of the quoted lines in this film. But, to bring up Tom's point about the end and him saying, "I'm going to open all these restaurants," another part of that that's great is her saying, "Well, if it's for the good of my country," it's really kind of the first time she plays the game.
Yeah.
It's the first time that she, like, decides to be and makes the conscious effort to be flirty and kind of do things a little more like, yeah, we both know what we're saying, in a way that he's been trying to do from the start. I just think that every time I watch it, I get struck by just how well it strikes that balance,
I think it's really funny that it wasn't even supposed to be Melvyn Douglas at all. It
Yeah.
was supposed to be Cary Grant. But then they wanted to have someone that would let Garbo shine as opposed to have it be the two of them. And also, if it was Cary Grant, it would just be way too hard to not immediately fall in love with him and call her a bitch and move on.
But this movie's a nightmare with Cary Grant. Like, because
yeah, it wouldn't work.
One of the things I noticed, and I've been texting Tom about these movies as I watch them, but Ninotchka is kind of loosely remade a number of times. So, like, the very next year after Ninotchka, MGM makes a film called Comrade X. I have this right here, which is, it uses the same general plot, but it is not an official remake of Ninotchka. And yet its poster's tagline is the funniest love comedy since Ninotchka, so they weren't even hiding it. Comrade X stars Clark Gable. And Tom, I'm going to set you up for this. I know you've been waiting for this one. And Clark Gable's co-star is Hedy Lamarr.
Headley.
There we go. I wanted to let you have that. Comrade X is trying to do the Ninotchka thing, but it fails in a couple ways. What they do is they change the dynamic where Clark Gable is playing an American journalist in the Soviet Union who is sneaking out information about Stalin's oppression under the name Comrade X. And Hedy Lamarr plays a woman train conductor who he convinces to leave the country to go spread communist propaganda in America, but he's actually doing it because her father wants it. It's a mess. And I think part of why the movie is a mess, and it comes through again, so you've got Clark Gable and Comrade X. Then you fast forward ahead about 20 years or so, and they make a Broadway musical and later a movie musical of Ninotchka called Silk Stockings with Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse. And in that one, Astaire's character is an American movie producer, and instead of fighting over jewels, they're fighting over a Russian composer who's living in France, but Russia wants him to come back. And also very bizarre. Bella, you haven't seen Silk Stockings, right?
I don't think so, no.
Yeah. I'm gonna make you watch it because it is so weird to see musical numbers done in this story, because it's not a thing that lends itself to a musical. And Tom, you should watch it because Ivanov is played by Peter Lorre. So you got that going for
Yes.
it.
I'm
And
going
he's
to
playing in
open a
Her City.
restaurant.
He's the one that gets that line, Tom. I'm not kidding.
You're going to eat at my restaurant. It's a very
Yeah.
nice place for
And-
families.
And he's the one that does the line where he goes, "And piroshkis," and you're like, it sounds like a threat when you say that, Peter. But Silk Stocking, the reason I bring both of those up is that part of the reason the dynamic doesn't work in either of those films is that Clark Gable and Fred Astaire are leading men. They are very good leading men, but you're immediately on their side. When they're being seductive, they're being like, yeah, they're too charming. They're too seductive. And so, Bella, like you noted, like when the woman initially rejects him, you just kind of write her off and be like, "What are you talking about? That's Clark Gable," or "What are you talking about?" And the joke is entirely on the Ninotchka character. Or in Comrade X, her name is Theodore. But the joke is entirely on them. What I think is so great about Melvyn Douglas and Ninotchka is that he's kind of a twerp. You know, like he's one of those guys where he's charming and flirty because Melvyn Douglas, and I say this with all respect for Melvyn Douglas, you're right, he's not Cary Grant, he's not Clark. Like, Clark Gable's a guy who, as soon as he shows up on screen, you go, who the fuck is that? He's a very handsome man. I think the thing about Melvyn Douglas is he's fine looking, right? Like, he's not a particularly...
He's a 7.5.
Right.
You know, it's funny. I have, I'm just looking at my notes, and two of the first lines I have when we rewatch the movie is, quote, "God, this man needs to shut up." And then the second line is, "She is way too good for him."
Funny enough, those are two things you said after our first date. So, you know.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah.
those weren't notes about the movie. They were just her thoughts about what led her to this place.
Can I tell you, that's what I've been worried about this whole episode, is that it's just eventually going to turn into me going, well, I mean, the problem with Ninotchka is she just kind of gets too swept up in work, and she really needs to, you know, chill sometimes. And Bella just goes, well, the problem with Melvyn Douglas's character is he needs to get more serious about his fight, and it just becomes just...
It's really, I have so many notes that are way longer about why Melvyn Douglas sucks, not the actor, but the character. And I'm not going to read any of them because I would open myself up to too much ridicule. But
well, number one, he's a dirty Frenchman. There you go. Number two, that mustache. That mustache is...
I like the mustache. I think it's cute. It's a little... Okay, maybe not, but it's, I don't know, it works for him.
I like that your maybe not was as though you saw the look in my eyes that said, should I grow the mustache? And then you had to quickly go, no, don't do that. Don't you dare.
Please don't. Please don't do that.
This is where Tom comes in and says, Mike can't grow that mustache.
That's true. I really can't. I have an
Thank God.
I have an beard. Like, I can't do facial hair. My hair's too light. But no, I think that that's the thing that makes this movie work, is that Melvyn Douglas is, I mean, you know, you mentioned Greta Garbo being this beautiful woman. I mean, you know, in the Ninotchka character, Ninotchka is a gorgeous woman who does not know or care that she is attractive. Meanwhile, Melvyn Douglas is an okay-looking guy who mostly gets by on the fact that he is so charming that you said, Bella, you said he was a 7.5, you said? But
it depends how drunk I am, but yeah.
Right. But that's the thing, but he's 7.5, but he's one of those guys who understands that he is just attractive enough that if he is really charming and cute and flirtatious, that's going to be what gets him all the way. He knows he's not Clark Gable.
Honestly, if he was like in sweats and like a t-shirt or something, he would be a solid 5. But I think the suit, like the really well-tailored suit, brings him up to a 7.
I'm just imagining Melvyn Douglas in sweats and a...
I feel like that's a very pointed description. Because I was going to say, well, Bella, you must be drunk a lot for that to be a 7.5.
Okay.
No, but, you know, I do want to jump on that and what you're saying about the suits, because I do think that's interesting, too. One thing I noticed on this viewing that I hadn't noticed before is that the costuming in this film is very conscious. When Ninotchka first... Because it's interesting that the film uses color so well, despite being black and white. that when they first have their encounter, when Ninotchka and Melvyn Douglas first meet, I have to remember his name. Is it Count Louis? I keep calling
It's Leon.
Leon. Thank you. I keep calling him his actor name and her character name. When they meet, she is in drab, gray, very Soviet, sexless clothes, and he is in a sharp, tailored, black tux, white shirt. So that when the two of them are on top of the Eiffel Tower, even though the movie's in black and white, he looks so much more colorful than her because the shades that he's wearing are so dynamic. And then as the movie goes on, once she's charmed by him and after the laugh happens, you notice there's a little more frill to her shoulders, and then ultimately she wears the dress. But conversely, he is moving a little more away from the tux so that when they finally meet in Morocco, his suit is gray. He's taken down that black and white and that tux to now more of a gray suit. Her clothing is a lot less drab and rigid. And I thought that was just so interesting, the way that they communicated, the way they kind of come together via that costuming, especially because you don't think about the use of blacks versus grays when you're talking about black and white films the same way we talk about the use of color in a Gone with the Wind or a Wizard of Oz or something,
Yeah, well, speaking of that pivotal dress moment, I think it might at least indirectly be inspired by um this portrait of Princess Anastasia wearing a really similar gown. It's that same off the shoulder with the wide puffy sleeves and the jewels, like essentially in the exact same spots. And I really wonder if they actively chose to inspire her like big reveal gown on something that her character would have frankly hated and obviously would have said is a waste of jewels and fabric.
In the portrait of Princess Anastasia, is Bartok the Bat in that portrait, or did they leave him out of that one?
um
Um,
Maybe he's in the
Why
shadows.
did I have the name Bartok so ready?
Because you are a deranged adult way into animation, you absolute dork.
But no, I think that's a great point. And, the other thing I thought was interesting in this film, watching it, especially this time, is, it's something Tom and I complain about a lot now with modern films and how uh, modern film going on Twitter will. I think I think about this so much because of Tom just chose a weird delivery when he said this, and now it lives in my brain, even though he may not remember saying it. Which is
I
when we
don't.
talked on our Oscar episode, we talked about Trial of the Chicago 7. Tom said, "Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry films don't look into the camera and go, socialism is good," and shook his face like Nixon. But I think about that a lot.
Socialism, baby.
But I think about that a lot in terms of like, there's so many movies now that try to have any nuance, and there are people online, a lot of the film Twitter crowd will be like, well, this is mildly critical of my perspective and my politics. One thing I think is interesting about Ninotchka is, look, it is a movie that depicts Stalin's Russia as drab and oppressive, in its final scenes. But even so, one thing I think is interesting is, even though the plot hinges on jewels that were confiscated from former Russian royalty, the movie never actually explicitly condemns that. Like, the movie does not, if this movie has a villain, it is the Countess. She
Yeah.
is an asshole, but also that the movie never says, like, that the movie basically presents the point of the Countess goes, I can't steal these jewels, they're mine. And Ninotchka goes, they belong to the people, they were paid for with the blood of the people. And the movie just presents those two arguments and doesn't actually slam it,
It's just, like you said, you can't have nuance today, and it kind of just presents it as, because it's still like it's still fresh at the time. It's like people were still alive when that uprising happened, so it's like a thing where you could just say it, and the movie does just go like, "Oh, you stole our jewels." Yeah, but you're an asshole, so it's kind of good we stole from you assholes because Jesus Christ, it's been a few years and you're still being such fucking assholes to people to the point where one of my favorite things about the movie, which goes to the way rom-coms now don't do it, is that she never thinks Melvyn Douglas did anything to her.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it would be she would think Melvyn Douglas stole the jewels out of the safe and gave it back to the Duchess, and the Duchess would be like, "Well, yes, he did. So you should leave him alone because that's my man." And she would storm off back to Russia, thinking Melvyn Douglas was a bad guy. It's just no. The Duchess straight up says, "Oh no, he had nothing to do with this. You should still leave him alone, but he had nothing to do with this."
What I find so funny is that in real life, John Gilbert, who Garbo was really close with later in life, um, proposed to Garbo. Garbo said no, so he went to the lady that played Swanna, Ina Claire, and they became married.
Ina Claire, who
So,
is fascinating because she has like almost no credits, like no film credits.
yeah.
I also found out apparently she caused a scandal because she did racy publicity photos for 1932's The Greeks Had a Word for Them, which is,
I believe it.
I want to take a minute to acknowledge the title, The Greeks Had a Word for Them, and
That
it's like we
sounds
don't make titles good anymore.
that sounds like the start of a Gilbert Gottfried joke or something. Like,
So Silk Stockings is interesting because that in the musical they decide to make it not about jewels and make it not about the confiscation of that, and instead make it just there's this Russian composer who's living in France. Fred Astaire wants him to write the music for his next picture, but the Russian government wants him to come back, and that's why they send the envoys. The problem with that is that the Russian composer can speak for himself. So the conflict of should he go back to Russia or should he stay in France, you can now have somebody go, why don't we ask him? Whereas the jewels are such a neutral and they are such a symbol in a way that the movie never has to tell you should the jewels go back to the Countess or
well,
should they go to.
it also goes to the writing of the movie in that it is the Kickstarter for the movie, the plot of the movie, where Melvyn Douglas is playing these little schemes for the Duchess, and he's doing all this because he's a greedy little Frenchman, which, completely accurate. And by the end of the movie, he doesn't care about them anymore. He doesn't even talk about them anymore.
Well, according to Lubitsch, there is a reason for the jewels, and it is not one that you might think. They are, quote, photogenic, and you can photograph them sparkling on a woman's tits.
Honestly, I was gonna make a joke like that, and I'm glad it's just reality. I'm glad Lubitsch was just like, yeah, I like tits. What do you want? I want to heighten the titties. He would work well with the Italians.
Ernst Lubitsch was the original Russ Meyer, in a way. But no, and the original Roger Ebert, I guess, as well. It's funny watching these films like Comrade X and Ninotchka and all these films of the time they talk about Russia. It does appear like if there is a joke being made about Russia, the joke is not even at the expense of the concept of communism so much as like, there's jokes in this film and in Comrade X about the 5-year plan, right? And around this point, the 5-year plan, which I think Melvyn Douglas has the line, "I've been a fan of your 5-year plan for the last 15 years."
Yeah.
The three of them, Bulyanov, Ivanov, and Kopolsky, are selling these jewels because the country is going through famines and is badly in debt because of the disastrous failure of Stalin's implementation of a 5-year plan. The movie never seems to be a criticism of Russia, but it is a criticism of Stalin's Russia. And it is interesting to think about the fact that, like, especially because, 10 Days That Shook the World isn't that old at this point. It is interesting to think about how some of the point of view that this movie takes and some of these films of this time takes is less a criticism of the Soviet Union as a concept and more like, hey, it seemed like you guys might have had a good thing going here, maybe a little lofty and ambitious, and this whack job's screwing it up. You know what I mean? Which is an interesting thing.
As the way the movie counterpoints everything by making that kind of like, okay, well, the Soviet Union maybe wasn't bad. They are counterpointing the opposite, the capitalist side, not with Melvyn Douglas's character necessarily. It's with the Duchess, and that she's so like very capitalistic that she's willing to do some devious, horrible shit to this poor woman who did nothing to her just to get fucking jewels back that clearly she doesn't even need because she's living the high life, just fucking rolling around France like she's like who the fuck she is. It's very much like, well, communism's kind of not going so great in Russia because some of the planning didn't go well, but capitalists are fucking assholes.
Well, and also, I think the best jab at capitalism in this film is one of my favorite moments, and we talked about it in a previous episode. Because this movie does have one moment that's very similar to a film we covered recently, which is, and I'm sure you probably noticed it too, Tom, which is both this and Sullivan's Travels have a moment where a rich person talks to his butler to try and go, well, I understand the poors, and the butler has to go, no, you don't. In this case, it's that moment where...
But also making the joke that the butler's also kind of a moron.
No, but see, that's the interesting thing is that I didn't read it that way. The first time I saw this movie, I thought that was it, right? The first time I saw... Are you talking about like when he says, I wouldn't want to share my bank account with you? That moment?
Yeah.
See, here's the thing. The first time I saw this movie, I thought that's what it was. I thought the joke was like, but then I realized, especially watching other films around this time, that joke is a jab at quote-unquote rich people. Because what he's really saying, because remember, he starts by saying, you haven't paid me for 2 weeks or 2 months or whatever it is, like the last 2 months. You haven't paid me the last 2 months. And then when he says to have to share my bank account with you, that's a joke about the fact that a lot of these rich people, especially in the 30s, and especially like Melvyn Douglas, who don't really have a job, they're not actually rich.
Yeah.
They accrue a lot of debt. They spend like assholes. So the joke there, in a way, when the butler says to share my bank account with you, is basically him going, you're my boss, I'm your servant, but also I probably have more. I would just be paying your debts if we shared money. If we shared accounts, I would be paying off your debts because you aren't actually wealthy. So it's a bit of a jab at the idea that like a lot of these rich people aren't just rich beyond their means; they're actually spending beyond their means. Whereas the working class people in America or in France are just working, making a living. It's like the Sullivan's Travels butler who kind of just turns around when his boss is like, well, don't you care about the dignity? He's like, man, I just want to fucking clock out and go home. Like, that's it. I make a living. I go home. I don't care.
Mike, I feel like you're spreading communistic propaganda in the powder room again.
One of the best. Another just great line. Well, that, the one thing I thought about with this, there is a scene that I hate to do more of this, like, well, today they wouldn't, But the moment when they come back after you've been spreading she's spreading communist propaganda. When they get back to the hotel room and they're both drunk and they're doing just a little bit of like, there's no drama to it or anything. It's just them going back and forth and her saying she should be punished. So he pops the champagne and she acts like she's been shot by a firing squad and drops. And then he puts the jewels on her and she has one of my favorite line deliveries is that adorable her going like, can I make a speech now? It's great. One thing that strikes me about that scene is I think in a modern movie, and especially the way we talk about movies, I can see so many people going, why was that scene in there? It didn't advance the plot at all. It didn't do X, Y, Z. There's no advancing of the plot or anything, but it's such a great moment. Her little drunken, can I make a speech? Him putting the tiara on her, all of that, and I think that it's such a beautiful little moment where those two characters get to be, number one, get to be human, and number two, one thing I was thinking about is modern romantic comedies, because the dynamics are all about the romantic tension. I don't know if you guys find this too, but like, I can't think of the last time I watched a romance film where I can actually picture what those two are like in their day-to-day. You
Well,
know what
'cause
I mean? Like,
they're never written like human beings. It's always like, oh well, she's a high executive at some blah 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 company, and he's the sweaty fucking bike riding surgeon guy, and they do all these things, and you're like, all right, they're job descriptions, but what are they as people?
well, and like you can have moments where they connect flirtatiously, but like, what are Owen Wilson and Jennifer Lopez actually doing on an off day? What are they doing on the days that's just like, I don't know, we're just gonna have an around the house day. Like, what does that look like? Whereas
That's why that run of Apatow movies, Knocked Up and Forgetting Sarah Marshall and shit. We may knock the movies that followed them for trying to do the improv thing, but those improv though that run was so good because they knew what they were at least concise and tight. They had these scenes where it would just be them being characters, being
well,
people, where you get to know who they are.
and that's
I
why that drunken scene to me is so good because you do get to see like, oh, this is what they are. This is what they would be like. This is what they will be like
Well,
as their life goes on.
it's the scene in Knocked Up where him and Paul Rudd go to Vegas and do shrooms, and her and Leslie Mann go to a club and get drunk and fucking. It's just like you can just have moments where characters are characters instead of, because I feel honestly it feels like most romantic movies now have to be like high concept, and you
Yeah.
have to like justify the concept and keep like, oh well, this is why this thing is happening now, and this is why this thing is happening now. It's just like, whatever happened to just two people that fall in love? Like, why do we have to do a thing where Owen Wilson's a dumb shit in a crowd with a
And
sign, and J Lo says, "Sure, yeah, sure, why not?" Owen
and the other
Wilson,
thing is,
Yeah.
this is a high concept rom com,
but
but
it
still
doesn't.
manages to make them people.
Because it doesn't focus on the high concept. That's the thing. It's the high
Yeah.
concept is just a MacGuffin. But like nowadays, the MacGuffin is the movie. They have to keep justifying this high concept because now it's like, what, we can't just watch two people talk and get to know each other. I mean, like, they talk about, people always want them to do another Before movie with Richard Linklater and Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, but it's like, I don't know if if that movie can exist anymore, because like
Yeah.
Linklater's still making movies, but like that Apollo 10 and a half came and went on Netflix, and it's like a good little movie, but it's a Richard Linklater movie, and it's just people doing things, and
Yeah.
people can't just do things anymore. And this isn't even like a grand thing of like, oh, we only make comic book movies. It's like, no, comic book movies are better at having scenes where it's just characters riffing and you get to know them. Like,
Well, I mean, you do have those scenes in, I think, modern romantic comedies of them just being, going to IKEA and buying shower curtains. Like, you do have those, except they are in a montage and they are just, you don't really see them have much interaction. They're just really quick, like, you know, slice of life excerpts from their relationship or them falling in love or them married or what have you. Whereas, and I would argue that Greta Garbo and Melvyn Douglas, you n- that scene really goes to show that they do interact with each other as just people, as opposed to just like, we don't just fuck, we don't just um argue about communism and capitalism, and we don't just rip each other's clothes off. We also have these silly interactions with one
See,
another.
I love that you pointed that out. That because you said those movies do have that scene, but it's in a montage, and I think that that's why I would argue they don't have that scene, because even when it's in a montage like that, it's not giving us a view of what their daily life is like. It's more, oftentimes when those scenes are put in a montage of them doing mundane things, it's meant to show us them growing closer together. It's like when Belle and the Beast have a snowball fight, or anything like that in the Beauty and the Beast montage, where it's like it's meant to show us like, oh, look at, they're starting to get together. Whereas the beauty of that moment in Ninotchka and the point where it happens is, that's it. They're in love with each other in that moment.
Yeah,
We're not seeing anything grow. We're just getting to see like,
they're just, it's just a way to get time to pass to get to the next plot beat. It's not actually like Ninotchka where it's you get it. It's just, yeah, now they're in love, and now they're at this point where we have to be in the movie.
yeah, in a way, I guess what it is like when it's in a montage, like Bella, and like Tom's pointing out, like when it's done in a more modern rom-com, those moments, those little moments that they have together are done as a way to build up. They're shown as a way to build you buying into this romance. Whereas what makes this moment, the champagne scene, so good in Ninotchka is that it's not working to convince you that they're in love. You have been convinced by the rest of the film, and what you're seeing there is the payoff. We haven't gotten our happily ever after yet, per se, but that is, oh, these two are actually in love. It happened, they connected, and now we get to just spend a little time with them happy before it all comes crashing down. And I don't think that a lot of romance films today take the time to give us the beat of them actually happy before a misunderstanding, because, like Tom pointed out, there's no point where she thinks Melvyn Douglas lied or anything like that. Too often now, just as the characters share a first kiss, then it's like, oh, whoopsie, it turns out I was paid to take you out on a date to the prom. Oh, I'll never get over, Too many movies end at the first kiss, and I think that this so well has a moment of letting us enjoy them just being in love,
Yeah, and I believe their relationship. And I think that there are so few modern day romantic comedies that, I don't walk away from some movie called Marry Me believing that Owen Wilson and Jennifer Lopez are going to stay together. I actually don't know if they stay together. I never saw that
We
movie.
are really
Plan
taking
to.
this movie we had taken this movie out back and given it the fucking
Tom, since you
Right.
don't remember what you say on podcasts, I'm going to let you know this isn't as bad as how much you really brutalize First Cow in our Sullivan's Travels episode.
Oh,
You go after First Cow.
I go after.
What do you have against cows? Oh
For
my
no
god.
reason.
Nothing. They taste great, but I don't want to watch a movie about them.
The fuck is wrong?
So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, and you should believe their relationship. Number one, you are in that relationship. I just gotta
Mike
tell
doesn't
you.
wear suits.
Yeah, this is as high class as he goes. A brand new Sex Pistols T-shirt.
This is not brand new. I've had this for years.
Okay, well then it's less
Okay.
tattered than some of the other shit you've put through with your ever expanding and shrinking body.
I love that shrinking is becoming a drag now.
Yeah, because you gotta just pick a lane, bro. You just pick a lane. Like, enough of this. Pick a lane. I've been this for 10 years. I know what I am. I don't know what the fuck's going on.
Years of making fat jokes at me, and you've now decided your new insult is you're losing weight, and somehow it still hurts.
Yeah, asshole. You've been in a relationship for 3 years. Why are you trying to lose weight, asshole? You should be comfortable. Enough of this shit. All right, there's two things we got to talk about before anything else happens, before we wrap up. One is a quick one. Guys, Bella Lugosi. I mean, come on.
Wait, whoa. This is kind of a letdown. Last time Bella Lugosi came up on the show, you flipped a chair.
All right, because this time he's showing up as a Soviet. I don't know what his rank is. Commissar. Yeah, I don't remember his rank. He's showing up Soviet Commissar. Pretty cool, and it's Bella Lugosi, so he can rock it with being as accurate a Russian as Sean Connery was. Being, yes, I'm from Russia.
Can I just say he looks like he fucks? Like, more so than Melvyn Douglas does at any given point in this movie.
Yeah, Bella
this man
Lugosi
looks like he
looks like he fucks drugs. That's what he looks like.
I need to acknowledge that what I loved is that by the end of Bella saying that sentence, I could see on her face a moment of, I'm going to text Mike later and say, don't keep that in.
Yeah, okay, but listen.
I don't mind.
Okay, because listen, he's a Soviet Commissar. Last time we saw him on the show, a week ago, I guess. I don't know what the schedule is. I don't know when these things come out. He showed up as the fucking devil in a Disney cartoon. That's so much fucking cooler. So I'm sorry. The devil or a Soviet Commissar? I'm going with the devil. I got a fucking bleeding demon head tattooed on my head, on my face, on my arm. Come on. I'm gonna choose.
Whoa!
What?
Did you have a stroke there for a second?
I mean,
you have something on your face?
Kind of last month I did.
Tom, the rapid fire with which Kyle is going to have to just take that clip out and extract it. The rapid fire with which you just, like a Max Headroom glitch. It wasn't even like you misspoke. It was truly the Max Headroom of just on my face, on my head, on my arm.
Okay. because you brought this up before we even got to season 2, a movie that references Ninotchka, which the director told his lead actor to watch Ninotchka to base his performance off of. Have you shown Bella Red Heat?
No, I have not. We have so many movies that we need to watch.
All right, well, stop
I have
watching
not put
fucking
Red Heat on the
cartoons.
pile.
Stop watching cartoons and watch big boy stuff like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jim Belushi fighting drug
No,
dealers.
no,
All right, so Walter
absolutely
Hill
not.
told Arnold Schwarzenegger, watch Ninotchka and base your performance off of Greta Garbo. Do what she's doing. And I don't know, I haven't watched Red Heat in like 10 years. I don't know if it's successful or not. Probably not. It's not one of Walter Hill's best movies. But, you know, Mike, make her watch it. Mike,
Okay.
Mike, hey,
No.
hey,
All right.
hey, you're the boss in this relationship. You make her
I'm
watch this
definitely
fucking...
not. I am so very much not.
I know this is somehow going to blow back on Mike, even though I said it.
It's gonna be like
It's not going to end well for anyone.
so. Tom said a couple things. A couple things I want to point out that I thought were really great in this. And then I have one thing I'm going to throw to the room before we talk Oscars. But you know, we're talking about things that a movie would do today. The iconic laughing scene. You know, the iconic Garbo Laughs scene. I loved that because it cuts. You know, she's sitting at the table all stone faced. Douglas falls. The crowd is laughing. And when we cut back, she is in full on laughter. And I think that a movie today would want to make a meal out of it and like show her start to crack a smile and start to go, you know, like show her kind of like, oh, they finally broke the Ice Queen. And I love that we never get to see her transition into laughter. They never make it a big thing. It just cuts from her stone face to her out and out laughing. That not only did he, you know, that when it cuts back, she's laughing, and he's indignant at first, too. That the beauty of that scene is not just, oh, she finally, you know, got the stick out and started laughing. It's that he realizes that if he really wants to get her to loosen up, if he really wants to connect with her, he can't maintain his I'm totally cool, I'm totally in control attitude. None of his jokes work. It's the fact that he needs to kind of eat shit for a minute for her to be willing to loosen up. Yeah.
Can I just point out that there is one semi-modern movie that also has a scene that's done equally as well as that. And that was in Magic Mike 2, when Joe Manganiello shows up at that gas station and does his striptease, and that gas station worker just looks so stone-faced. And then she laughs.
I need to acknowledge that not only do I agree with you there, but also that this is the second time Magic Mike XXL comes up on this season. And I think if you ask somebody, which episodes do you think that's coming up in? They're not saying The Godfather and Ninotchka.
I was actually about to say, was it in The Godfather?
Yes. Because as I
God.
once told, we can't get into it now. Everybody go back to the Patrick Willems episode. So the only other thing I want to point out is that when we're talking about these moments where these characters transform, like Garbo is incredible in this film because her transformation is so there for us to see. The character that we meet at the end of the movie is not the character from the beginning, and she does an amazing job kind of transforming. But I do want to say one moment that I love, a very subtle moment, is when they're out and the Countess comes over to their table and kind of disrupts it, and it kind of just says some shitty things and then leaves. And Ninotchka's upset. I love that it's quiet for a while. That Douglas's character is so browbeaten by the Countess and so polite and formal to her, and he never stands up for Ninotchka. And then they're just sitting there, and Ninotchka's obviously hurt. And here's this character, Melvyn Douglas, who, you know, Bella, you said one of your notes at the top is this guy needs to shut up. He never stops talking. He's always got a line for everything. And here's the moment where it's so important for him to say something, and he has no words. Because up until this moment, he has always had to coast on his charm, and he's in Paris. He's in Paris where everything's a good time. You never have to think about the bad things. You can just keep drinking and spending money and having fun. And finally, in this moment, he needs to be more. And I love that he kind of just slowly works his way into... She can't say to him, you know, hey, I need you to comfort me. So instead, she just tells him to tell her a joke. even though she hates all his jokes, tell me a joke. And he starts to tell a joke, and then he starts talking about the two of them together. It's such a sweet moment because it's the first time that he's had to be fully sincere, you know? And I think that's such a beautiful little moment for the two of them. Bella, did you have any more thoughts before? I've got one question for everybody, and then we're going to talk Oscars. Did you have any more things you wanted to make sure you noted?
I think that I have just shared a lot of quotes because most of most of my notes are either quotes or Melvyn Douglas just so infuriating sometimes. Um, but no, I mean, I do want to point out because earlier in the episode we talked about whether or not Ninotchka was a success. I have a note here that says over 400,000 people saw it in its 3-week run in Radio City Music Hall alone. So it was a success.
Well,
So that's
at least
exciting.
in New York. As we learned from Sullivan's Travels, it may not play in Pittsburgh. But so one question I do want to ask the two of you, and I have my answer too. And Tom, I know this is only a one-time watch for you, but this movie has an incredible script. We didn't even talk much about Ernst Lubitsch as a director or Billy Wilder as a writer. That said, we have plenty of time for both, as many Ernst Lubitsch films are in the registry, including another one of Bella's favorites, Shop Around the Corner, and To Be or Not
Such
to
a good
Be.
movie.
And Billy Wilder, obviously, we talked about last season. We'll keep talking about. We talked about twice last season. We'll keep talking about. But I do just want to ask, great script, great comedy. What is everyone's favorite joke in the film? I'll start with Bella. What is your favorite? If you had to pick one, what is your favorite joke in the film?
I mean, I really do like the little father bit because that's great. But I think my absolute favorite, Mike, I'm sorry, I'm going to steal from you
You know
because I
it's
think
mine
this is
too.
your
Yeah,
favorite
it is
too.
mine. Yeah.
Yeah, in the beginning of the movie when I'm just going to keep calling them
Bulyanov,
three
Ivanov, and
comrades.
Popovsky. Yeah.
I know. See, like I know what their names are now, but it's too long to say it. This is me with all Russian names. I say this as someone with a very long Russian name. When they are trying to find the person that they're looking for, and they initially think it's that man, and he just, they're following this man, and when they're like, oh wait, is this the guy? This could be him, and then he just does a Heil Hitler, and they're like, oh no, definitely not
It's
him.
you're right. You stole it. That is my favorite joke, but it's not even because of the Heil Hitler bit. It's the fact that they just go, "This must be
I
him."
would hope not.
No, but as in them going like, "This must be it. This must be our man. This is our man, obviously." And then he does the Heil Hitler to someone, and it is Ivanov's reaction. They're all stone faced, and Ivanov just goes, "No, that's not him." It's not. If any of them were horrified, it wouldn't be the deadpan of just it's him. It's him. That's not him. So good. Yeah. Tom, what might have been your favorite joke in the film?
First one that comes to mind is the cigarette joke. Just because.
Oh, the cigarette girls, and you must have been smoking a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, because those three guys, they're fucking. Like, it's just. Like, it's just like, oh, these guys come to France and they're just fucking. Like, it's just fun. It's a funny joke. I don't know.
But it's also the humor of, it's not just that they're Russian people. Because in Silk Stockings, two of the Russian envoys they have in that, because they're theater actors and they have to sing, are pretty good-looking guys. It's the fact that it's these three bureaucratic dweebs.
They're fucking
that
gremlins.
In their country, they would not be anybody's top choice. But they come to France, and there's something exotic about them. And
Well,
so
it's
these
also-
three French maids show up, and,
It's
because
also,
there's
I think it's because they're misappropriating Soviet funds
Well,
to get
yes,
laid.
but I'm saying there is that great moment where it's the one cigarette girl shows up. Then we watch her run out, and you start to think, oh, did these guys do something inappropriate? Like they freaked this girl out. And then she comes back with two more, and they're all excited to go in, which is great.
Some of that Ruski money.
Now, Bella, you might already know this because you did you read the book, so you know a lot of this. But I'll throw this out there, especially Tom. How do you think this film did at the Oscars?
I don't know. I'd probably won nothing. I think because you mentioned Garbo didn't win for acting in this.
But what do you
so-
think it got? Did it get any nominations? What do you think it?
Well, other than Garbo, I'll say it probably got a writing nom and Best Picture.
Okay, and Bella, do you know offhand, or do you want to take a guess, or do you have it written down? I don't know.
I do not have it written down, and I'm kicking myself for not
That's fine.
having it here.
So, Tom, You are as right as you possibly could be. This gets 4 nominations, but 2 are for writing. It was nominated for Best Picture. It was nominated in that miracle year of 1939. So I'll do one more trivia. Tom, do you remember the other 1939 Best Picture winners? Best Picture nominees from that glorious year? I want to see how many you remember offhand.
I don't remember what I ate for dinner yesterday.
Okay. That is the year that Gone with the Wind wins.
All right, that's because George Cukor was supposed to direct this and didn't because he got pulled on to Gone with the Wind. Correct. Okay.
Yep. And then George Cukor also 2 years later directs Garbo's final film, Two-Faced Woman, where she is paired again with Melvyn Douglas. That movie was very poorly received, and it was so poorly received that she was just like, fuck this, I don't want to do this anymore. Also, that movie's bad. Two-Faced Woman is terrible. And it's weird. They both look like they're 50 years older than they were in Ninotchka. The other nominees are Dark Victory, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, Love Affair, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Of Mice and Men, Stagecoach, The Wizard of Oz, and Wuthering Heights. An absolute goddamn murderer's row of nominees. This is our, I think, 3rd time talking about one of the Best Picture nominees. So to show you how good a year that was, no, 4. Last season, the very first year of the Film Registry, they induct Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This year, they induct Ninotchka, and in future years, they will induct Stagecoach and Wuthering Heights, so a murderer's row year. Ninotchka, as we noted, was also nominated for Best Actress for Greta Garbo, who loses to Vivian Leigh for Gone with the Wind. It was nominated for Best Story, because back then they split the category in story and screenplay. Nominated for Best Story, it lost Best Story to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and was up for Best Screenplay, but lost that to, again, Gone with the Wind.
Boo.
So nominated 4 times. Nominated four times. Kyle could just cut your track. Nominated 4 times
to this shit.
Nominated 4 times, and 4 categories, did not win any of them. Notably, Comrade X, which was the ripoff Ninotchka, was nominated for Best Story the following year in 1940. And as I noted, that was the last time Garbo would be nominated, and obviously Melvyn Douglas would go on to win Oscars later on for HUD and being there. Bella, I want to thank you for coming on and for joining the show. Did you have anything that you wanted to plug?
No, I do not. I am just a creature of endless fame.
Okay. No social media, nothing you want to throw out there at the end, right?
No, I would say please follow me on all social media platforms, but please don't. I don't say anything funny.
Okay. And I just want to say on a personal note before we wrap up, I'm really glad we got to do this. You know, Tom and I had a previous podcast that was when you and I started dating. And I think you explicitly said, don't talk about me on your stupid podcast. And now you're on this one, and you did a lot of work to be on this one. And, you know, when we met, you weren't really super into movies. And I think that, you know, together, you've really discovered a new appreciation for cinema and what film can do. And that's something that it was something that was mine, a love of movies, but now it's something that we share. And I think that, you know, I think that's fair to say, right? That you and I now, this is something that we share, this love of cinema, right?
Yes, but also to quote the great Garbo, sometimes I just want to be alone.
Sure, but I'm saying like that's something that we I'm being sincere when I say this. That's something that we share.
Okay.
That's something that we share as a love of film, and it's something that you come to appreciate. And that's why you're not going to be mad that I just spent hundreds of dollars at the estate sale for former Paramount head Robert Evans and bought a bunch of his ties and shirts. And everybody else, stick around. We'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
We're done.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of each episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, Those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks.
So I had a number of options I could have gone with Ninotchka, and a number of ones that I was considering, from using the Russian aspect of this film to evoke other Russian set films, like a Don Bluth Anastasia or something like that, which will find its way into the registry at some point and find its way into my picks at some point. Or I could have gone, I thought about 1939 is such a murderer's row year. Do I talk about Love Affair? Do I talk about Goodbye, Mr. Chips or Dark Victory, which are all good films that should be in? But the crux of this, to me, is two things. One, the mismatched romance, right? She's uptight and he's more of a cad, and he needs to kind of get her to loosen up, and she needs to get him to step up and take responsibility, right? And there's even a moment, the whole relationship with the Duchess, where she just kind of reintroduces herself and kind of conveys to Ninotchka, no, he's kind of a cad. He's not your perfect guy. He's a bit of a cad. So I thought about that, and then I also thought about the fact that, especially, for a long time, Garbo Laughs. The Garbo laughing moment is iconic. That this movie built up to a moment that just is burned into cinema history. And that made me think of another film that has a similar relationship dynamic and also has one of the most replicated and parodied and famous scenes in movie history. That even if the rest of the movie was bad, you just go well, that's iconic. Kyle submitted to the registry last year Spider-Man. And even if the rest of Spider-Man fades from history, that upside down kiss is one of those moments that you're like, oh, this is indelible cinema. My pick hasn't a moment that's indelible cinema, and it is a romance moment between, the lowly cad and the uptight woman, which is one of the most famous scenes in cinema, one of the most parodied scenes in cinema. Two dogs sitting at a table with a plate of spaghetti and meatballs, and they're slurping up spaghetti, and they kiss. It's 1955's Lady and the Tramp, which was also the first animated film in CinemaScope. I thought of it initially because it's just, oh, well, there's that dynamic there, and what an iconic scene. Because it's more than just, when we do this, it's more than just kind of going, this movie I like is like this movie we watched. It's, movies that deserve to be in the registry. And I think Lady and the Tramp's a great film. But I also think that just in terms of preserving our cinematic history, that scene, the spaghetti scene, is iconic. And Walt originally wanted to cut it, apparently, but you look at it and it's been copied so many times. It's just a perfect scene. Even if you don't like the rest of the film, there's no argument that scene is iconic. Much like Garbo laughing is just so iconic in Ninotchka. And the role that the Duchess plays in this film, in Lady and the Tramp, gets picked up by that brilliant song by the dog Peg of "He's a Tramp, but I Love Him." Lady and the Tramp, one of the great animated films of all time, one of the great Disney films of all time. Beyond all that, for that scene alone, the spaghetti scene alone, deserves to be in the National Film Registry. So my pick is 1955's Lady and the Tramp.
So with my pick, it's a movie I had watched for the first time recently, and it actually I think fits pretty well because it is about a mismatched couple, where it's this kind of political divide, and they are attracted to each other despite it, and they kind of change. Well, the guy changes for the better, and the girl is the constant, almost kind of like Ninotchka, but not exactly. But the basic idea is there with this sort of clash of cultures thing, and it's I think it's a very well observed, very low key, but very beautiful movie. It's just very honest, and it even ends with them sort of acknowledging yeah, we love each other, but this probably isn't gonna last. We probably only have a year together. And the girl goes, yeah, but what a year that's gonna be. Imagine a year of us together. How great. And I just that's, I don't know, that's kind of fits into the thing, like I said a few episodes ago, where I tend to like the romantic movies where the couples don't end up together because they acknowledge they just aren't gonna be copacetic despite their love for each other. It's a movie that stands out in this director's filmography, and it's a director whose movie I picked a few weeks ago. It's Clint Eastwood's 1973 movie Breezy, a movie that he directed because he just found that he started He's starting to direct now. So he picked this small movie that wasn't a big financial risk. It still bombed because Universal didn't know what to do with it, which is one of the reasons he soured very hard on Universal and ended up becoming a Warner Brothers guy. But it's William Holden and Kay Lenz, and he's this playboyish older guy, and she's this young hippie flower child who's just very like upbeat and positive about everything, and he's this heartbroken old man, and he's just like, why the fuck are you so happy about everything? Life sucks. But something about her just wakes him up and makes him want to love again, even if it's, like he said, only for a year. And it's got that Clint just honesty and that well-observed thing he does where he's just trusts the actors, and it's nothing like, even with Bridges of Madison County, it's nothing like he's done while still feeling very Clint Eastwood. And like I said when I brought up Bridges of Madison County a few episodes ago, I think he needs to be very well represented in the film registry because there's nobody like him in American film since he started directing. And I actually do love this movie. I think it's kind of a low-key masterpiece, and I think everyone should see it. And I think being in the registry would get some more eyes on it. It just recently got a great Kino Lorber Blu-ray disc, so I'm glad that still is alive and well. So Breezy, 1973, guys, check it out. Some might say you're missing out if you haven't seen it.
Let's all go to the lobby, lobby, lobby.
Thank you again to Bella Zaydenberg for joining us. Next week, Jeremy Swanton and Kyle Reed Haas return to the show for a pre-code musical, 1932's Love Me Tonight. Don't forget to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Here on You're Missing Out.
They honor movies of historical, cultural, or aesthetic importance on the National Film Registry.